The earth beneath our feet feels solid, but beneath the surface, the planet is full of many moving parts. When that movement suddenly releases an enormous amount of energy, the ground itself becomes a weapon. Buildings collapse, roads split apart, entire communities can disappear in minutes. And sometimes, the earthquake is only the beginning. From one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded, to a disaster that killed hundreds of thousands of people, these are some of the most devastating earthquakes in human history. The 2010 Haiti earthquake. At first, it probably seemed like an ordinary afternoon. It was January 12th, 2010, and thousands of people were going about their daily lives in and around Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Then, at 4:53 p.m., the ground began to shake. The earthquake lasted only seconds, but those seconds were enough to bring entire buildings crashing down. Homes collapsed, hospitals were damaged, roads were blocked by debris, and throughout the capital, people began digging through the rubble with their bare hands, desperately searching for survivors. The earthquake measured 7.0 on the Richter scale. Powerful, but not extraordinary compared to some of the other earthquakes we will cover. Yet this earthquake would become one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern history. The destruction was made far worse by Haiti's vulnerable infrastructure and the fact that the earthquake struck close to the country's most heavily populated area. By the time the shaking stopped, hundreds of thousands of people were dead. Millions had been affected, and the capital had been transformed almost beyond recognition. But the Haiti earthquake teaches us something important about earthquakes. The strongest earthquake isn't necessarily the deadliest. Sometimes, it's not just the power of the earthquake that matters, it's where it strikes. The 1908 Messina earthquake. In the early morning hours of December 28th, 1908, the people of southern Italy were struck by what would become the deadliest earthquake in European history. At 5:20 in the morning, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake struck beneath the Strait of Messina, separating the island of Sicily from the mainland Italy. The shaking lasted for only 37 seconds, but in that short time, the cities of Messina and Reggio Calabria were almost completely destroyed. In Messina alone, at least 91% of buildings were either destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Thousands of people were buried beneath collapsing homes as they slept, while roads disappeared beneath enormous piles of rubble. But for those who survived the initial earthquake, another disaster was approaching. Around 10 minutes after the shaking stopped, the sea suddenly began to pull away from the coastline. Then, a tsunami reaching heights of up to 12 meters, nearly 40 feet, crashed into the shores of Sicily and Calabria. Tragically, many earthquake survivors had fled toward the waterfront to escape collapsing buildings. Instead, they found themselves directly in the path of the approaching waves. 3 waves struck the surrounding coastline, destroying boats, buildings, and sections of the waterfront while carrying people and debris back into the sea. The destruction left local authorities almost completely overwhelmed. Hospitals had collapsed, railway and telegraph lines were destroyed, and many doctors, police officers, and soldiers had been killed. Relief eventually arrived from across Italy and abroad. Russian and British sailors joined rescue operations, searching through the ruins and helping evacuate survivors. By the time the scale of the disaster became clear, around 120,000 people had been killed. Messina had lost almost half of its population, and much of its historic center had simply disappeared. The catastrophe eventually changed how the city itself was built. During reconstruction, new regulations required buildings to be designed with earthquakes in mind. More than a century later, the 1908 Messina earthquake remains the deadliest earthquake ever recorded in Europe. 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. On the morning of December 26, 2004, one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded struck beneath the Indian Ocean, just off the northern coast of Sumatra, Indonesia. The earthquake reached an estimated magnitude of between 9.2 and 9.3. The rupture stretched for more than 1,000 kilometers beneath the ocean and continued for several minutes. It was so powerful that vibrations from the earthquake traveled around the entire planet. But the earthquake itself was only the beginning. The sudden movement of the ocean floor displaced an enormous volume of water, generating a tsunami that began racing across the Indian Ocean. In parts of Indonesia, waves reached approximately 30 meters, or nearly 100 feet, as they came ashore. Aceh, on the northern tip of Sumatra, was among the first and hardest hit regions. In some of the areas, the ocean suddenly receded from the shoreline before the tsunami arrived, exposing large sections of the seabed. Many people didn't recognize this as a warning. Minutes later, enormous waves crashed into the coastline, destroying the communities and carrying buildings, vehicles, ships, and debris inland. But the tsunami didn't stop in Indonesia. It traveled across the Indian Ocean, striking Thailand, Sri Lanka, and India before eventually reaching the eastern coast of Africa. Despite some areas having hours between the initial earthquake and the arrival of the tsunami, there was no Indian Ocean-wide tsunami warning system in place to alert the populations in its path. By the time the disaster was over, an estimated 228,000 people across 14 countries had been killed, making it the deadliest tsunami in recorded history. The scale of the disaster triggered a massive international humanitarian response, and eventually led to the development of new tsunami detection and warning systems throughout the Indian Ocean. The 2004 disaster demonstrated how the effects of a single earthquake could extend far beyond where the ground originally shook. It began beneath the ocean near Indonesia. Within hours, coastlines thousands of kilometers apart had been devastated. 1920 Haiyan earthquake. On the evening of December 16th, 1920, a massive earthquake struck north-central China. Centered near Huan, in what is now the Ningxia region, the earthquake is estimated at magnitude 7.9. It was powerful enough to produce the highest level of shaking on the Mercalli intensity scale, classified as extreme. The destruction was enormous. Hundreds of kilometers of the Haiyan Fault ruptured at the surface, while the shaking triggered more than 50,000 landslides across the region. Entire hillsides gave way. Villages were buried. Rivers were blocked, and in some places the landscape itself was permanently altered. In Huaiyan County alone, more than 70,000 people were killed. In nearby Guyana, tens of thousands more died, while towns such as Longda and Huaining saw nearly every house collapse. But the disaster did not end when the shaking stopped. Aftershocks continued for years, leaving survivors terrified of returning to damaged buildings. Many were forced to live in temporary shelters, just as a severe winter settled over the region. For people who had already lost their homes, food supplies, and family members, the freezing temperatures became another deadly threat. Modern estimates place the total death toll somewhere between roughly 259,000 and 273,000, making the Huaiyan earthquake one of the deadliest seismic disasters in recorded history. And the scale of the earthquake could be felt far beyond the region itself. The shaking was reported across a huge portion of China, and disturbances in bodies of water were observed as far away as Norway. The Huaiyan earthquake is remembered not only for the power of the initial shock, but for the chain of disasters that followed it. Collapsing buildings, tens of thousands of landslides, prolonged aftershocks, and a brutal winter that made survival even more difficult. In Huaiyan, the earthquake did not simply shake. It changed the landscape and destroyed entire communities, and left hundreds of thousands of people caught in a disaster that continued long after the first tremors had passed. 1976, Tangshan earthquake. In the early morning hours of July 28th, 1976, most of the residents of Tangshan, China, were asleep. At 3:42 in the morning, without a clear warning, the earth beneath the city ruptured. A magnitude 7.6 earthquake struck almost directly beneath Tangshan, violently shaking one of China's major industrial cities. The earthquake was relatively shallow, occurring only around 12 kilometers beneath the surface, and directly above it sat a city largely unprepared for what was about to happen. Within minutes, approximately 85% of Tangshan's buildings had either collapsed or become unusable. Electricity, water, and communications failed. Roads and railways were severely damaged, and bridges collapsed. Much of the city had effectively been destroyed. And because the earthquake struck in the middle of the night, countless residents were inside their homes when the buildings around them came crashing down. But the disaster wasn't over. Only hours later, at around 6:45 that evening, another enormous earthquake struck roughly 70 kilometers away. This second shock reached magnitude 7.0 and caused further destruction across an area already devastated by the first earthquake. It was followed by a long sequence of aftershocks, including 12 reaching magnitude 6 or greater. The human cost was staggering. China's official death toll eventually stood at more than 242,000 people. Some historians, however, have argued that the true number was at least 300,000. Hundreds of thousands more were injured. Tangshan's infrastructure was devastated. Railway lines buckled and trains derailed. Bridges failed. Mines flooded when electrical power and pumping systems stopped working. Around 10,000 coal miners had actually been underground when the earthquake struck. While many managed to escape within hours, some reportedly spent as long as 2 weeks trying to reach the surface. The earthquake was so powerful that it was felt as far as 1,100 kilometers away, across much of northeastern China and even into Mongolia and Korea. What made the Tangshan earthquake particularly devastating wasn't simply its magnitude. The fault ran directly beneath the city. Buildings had largely been constructed without adequate consideration for earthquakes. And unlike another major Chinese earthquake just 1 year earlier, Tangshan received no effective warning or evacuation. A city filled with hundreds of thousands of sleeping residents was struck almost directly beneath their feet. In a matter of minutes, Tangshan had become the site of one of the deadliest earthquakes of the modern era.